Well, good afternoon. We're about to start today's seminar. But before we do, please be aware of the exit signs in case we need to leave the room on urgent business, whatever that may be. For those that are on the internet, we encourage you very much to send in your emails as you're able as possible so that we have time for the Q&A and take your questions at that point. So with that, Corey?
Hi and welcome. My name is Corey Bach. I'm a staffer in the ARB's research division. I'm here to introduce Dr. Ken Karani. Ken is an associate researcher at UC Davis's Interdisciplinary Institute of Transportation Studies, where he applies behavioral science methods to understanding consumer responses to new transportation technologies. Dr. Karani's research explores how people use new technologies to shape their lives and how transportation and communication networks are marketed, operated, and regulated to enhance energy efficiency, air quality, safety, and social equity. His current research at UC Davis's Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Center includes household response to plug-in and fuel cell electric vehicles and consumer valuation of energy. Although Ken has a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from UC Davis, he considers himself a recovering engineer. I'd just like to add that Ken is one of California's most experienced and insightful observers of consumer attitudes towards novel transportation technologies, and it is a pleasure to welcome him to present his study findings today.
Thank you, Corey. So, with a nod to the time we have today and a presentation that is still too long, I'm just going to jump right in. The genesis of this is actually, I think, almost 4 years ago when we started to try to make this project happen. And we'll talk a little bit about why it took so long to get to today, where I'm giving you, in essence, sort of the exit seminar, the defense of my dissertation, if you will. The primary goal of the study was to answer these research questions. What are consumers' awareness, knowledge, experience, and valuation of plug-in electric and fuel cell vehicles? The question, of course, is interesting within a regulatory context of air quality standards. An important element of that is Section 177 of the Federal Clean Air Act, which has shaped this study in an important way. I'll get to that in a moment. Greenhouse gas emissions goals set by AB 32 in California and subsequent legislation and regulatory actions. All of these legislative initiatives, all of these regulatory actions supported by ancillary programs at the federal, state, and local levels, zero emission vehicle requirements, state levels primarily, vehicle purchase and use incentives across all scopes and levels of government, as well as investments in charging and fueling infrastructure for both plug-in and fuel cell vehicles. As an executive summary, so that you know the highlights and can leave if you get bored in the middle. Californians are generally unfamiliar with most advanced technologies and alternative fuel vehicles, or have misperceptions about the vehicles and their capabilities, believing them to be small and lacking in power and style. Consumers have little trust in new, untested technologies, but they tend to trust those they consider to be their peers with personal experience for vehicle validation. The only problem with these conclusions is that they're not ours. They are from a report to the Air Resources Board from 10 years ago. I could have plagiarized them for today, but I'll expand on them and specify them a little bit by saying that consumers, everywhere we looked, are generally unfamiliar with plug-in and fuel cell vehicles. Meaning that the first hurdle to growing markets for these vehicles is that so far so few households have yet to ask them whether these vehicles are right for them. Consumers are not monolithic in their response to what they characterize on the one hand as ZEV technologies and on the other hand as new technologies. They're not monolithic in their response to policy goals and policy tools. The differences across states and regions, it turns out, may be less important than the similarities. However, the differences within states and regions are correlated with respondents' ZEV valuations. I'll spend the rest of the talk explaining those two statements. So the importance of Section 177 of the Federal Clean Air Act, which allows other states to adopt California's clean air standards, is that many of them have. All of the states in various shades of green on this map are Section 177 states except for New Hampshire. All of these states except for New Hampshire, Delaware, and Washington have zero-emission vehicle requirements. All of these states in green are in this study, which is the truth, but not the whole truth. Washington, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, we have state-level analyses and models for those states. The states in light green, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, we have a report for them as part of the regional forum, the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. So the states in light green plus Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, there's a regional report for that region. So we have 8 state reports and a regional report coming out of this study. I will today focus mostly on results for California, but I'll present them within a comparative framework on the belief that we actually learned more by comparing more states to each other than by just presenting the California results alone. Multiple methods in the study, an online survey that was active from December of 2014 to January of 2015, a multiple state sample of new car buyer households. And the way we put that statement, new car buyers, into operation was the respondents had to have purchased or leased at least one new vehicle since January 2008. So within 7 years of the date of the survey. The total sample across all the states is 5,654. The sample for California is 1,671. Following the survey, we had a round of interviews with survey respondents in 3 of the states, the 3 western states. We selected respondents who had both a pro and con evaluation of ZEV in their survey responses, focusing primarily in the Portland area in Oregon, the Puget Sound area in Washington, and a bit all over the state, Sacramento, San Francisco Bay Area, San Diego, and Los Angeles in California. The follow-up interviews, in a sense, reviewed the survey, got into more detail, and of course a conversation about people's results and explanations of why they did what they did, and provides additional insight into what elements of zero-emission vehicles people understand and don't understand. I'll focus primarily today on the survey results, but everything about this is informed by sort of the interplay of these 2 studies in ways even I probably can't fully identify anymore. So I've used this word valuation, which I'm going to just measure in some sense in a very simple way. Will people, new vehicle buyers, design a plausible next new vehicle for their household that is a PHEV, BEV, or a fuel cell electric vehicle? If they will, then they have a positive valuation towards these vehicles. If they won't, if they stick with internal combustion engine vehicles or hybrid drivetrains, we assign them a negative valuation. So, if they're going to design these vehicles, they do so within a design space that we establish. What things can they manipulate? What do those things cost when they manipulate them? We start by establishing a starting vehicle. What vehicle do they think might be a next new vehicle for their household? If they really can't come up with one, then we'll go back to the vehicle that got them into the survey, which is their most recently purchased new vehicle. But the point is to establish a starting point either in the household's imagination of what they want to do next or what they've already done regarding vehicle purchases, and then say, okay, let's open up the envelope of possible drivetrain designs and see what you do with that. So assuming for the moment they start with an internal combustion engine vehicle, for hybrids we specify a fuel economy and a purchase price increment for that vehicle. For plug-in hybrids, we specify that when that battery is discharged, when you've used up all the electricity that you've stored from the grid, the fuel economy you're going to get is the equivalent of the hybrid drivetrain version. They then choose, do they want this car to operate more like the Prius plug-in, which is the engine may come on most any time under a wide variety of conditions, even when you're still using energy stored from the grid? Or do you want it to operate more like the BMW i3 Rex, where you run on gasoline until, or you run on electricity until the battery is discharged, and then the generator comes on, and you in essence are running on a liquid fuel. They choose the range over which they want that operation to last. They choose a charging duration. Once they've designed a drivetrain, we now have a battery size, so we can then tell them how long it would take to charge that battery at different power levels. So we don't present them with power levels as a choice, we present them with charging times as a choice. And they're also offered the choice of whether or not they want this vehicle to be capable of quick charging away from home. For battery electric vehicles, the choices are a bit simpler. It's charging and range mostly. And for fuel cell vehicles, it's range and do they want the option of home hydrogen refueling. We stipulate a nascent developing initial network of hydrogen fueling stations. They play multiple rounds of the games. In the first game, there are no incentives. The prices are what I would call realistically high for all of these vehicle designs. By the time we get to the third game, we're offering them incentives that are modeled after the incentives that are available or were available at the time of the survey. Everyone who designs a qualifying vehicle is given the equivalent of the federal tax credit that that car would earn anyway. They then get to choose only one of several other possible incentives. A state incentive on the purchase of the vehicle, a state incentive to pay for home charging or home hydrogen refueling, or single occupant access to HOV lanes, or reduced bridge and road tolls, or if they don't have workplace charging, they can assume it will be provided to them if they bought this vehicle. In this way, we're actually under-incentivizing the California respondents, because in California, you get the federal, you get the state vehicle purchase incentive, and you get the HOV lane. In the survey, they only get the state purchase rebate or the HOV sticker. In other states, we're over-incentivizing them because at the time of the survey, many of the other states had no state-level incentives. The point of the game isn't to try to mimic exactly the conditions in each state. The point of the game is to try to figure out what's interesting to consumers above and beyond the federal tax credit. Okay, given our definition of valuation, given the design game space as I've quickly outlined it, what overall are the results? Well, across the states and regions, 27 to 39% of the respondents designed their next new vehicle to be a fuel cell, battery, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. Those are the dark green bands at the top of the graphic. The states are ordered from most to least in terms of the sum of those three percentages. Oregon wins just barely because their sum total rounds up to 39%, California's rounds down to 38%. But there clearly is also a sort of east-west distinction here between the propensity of the respondents to design their next new vehicle to be either a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. The width of the columns in this style chart also conveys the sample size, and sample sizes are proportional to population, though not directly. I won't be making any population level estimates from these data immediately, but we see by looking at the areas within each column that despite the fact that the percentage of people in the NESCOM region who design the next new vehicle to be a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle is certainly less than that in California, the areas of those two sets of rectangles are fairly nearly approximate because of the population size in NESCOM, which is to say there's a smaller percentage of people who want their vehicle to be a plug-in or fuel cell, but there's about the same number of people. Incentives by state and region. So the green incentives at the bottom are the upfront state incentives for either the vehicle or home charging or home fueling, hydrogen fueling. The blue incentives at the top are the incentives that generally accrue value over time. So if you have an HOV sticker, that accrues value over time as you use it. Reduced bridge and road tolls, these things accumulate over time as I use it. And clearly the vast majority of people say, no, I'll take some money up front, off the cost of the vehicle. It makes sense that no one in Oregon is particularly interested because there are, as near as I can figure out, Here's how I can figure out there are 2 bridges in Oregon, it's 2 small bridges that have a toll on them, and there may or may not still be an HOV lane northbound on I-5 out of Portland headed to Vancouver, Washington. In the absence of facilities, people are not interested in these things. So we see that in the NESCOM region, reduced tolls is probably about as interested as a region is, even if it's only a few percentage of people, but it's a higher percentage of tolling roads. In California, it actually adds up to just about 1 out of 5 people choose something other than money up front. So these use incentives aren't entirely irrelevant. They're certainly not favored by most people, but they are quite specific as to whether or not you yourself can derive any value from them as to whether or not you use HOV lanes or use tolled facilities. So why do people design plug-in vehicles, or why don't they? And I'll cover this in 2 ways. One, we'll do some statistical modeling of these design game results by drivetrain type. And then we'll actually go to a set of post-game motivation questions where we just ask people, why did you do that? I won't put the math up. It's nominal logistic regression is the statistical technique that we use to explore the correlation structures between variables. But I'm just going to go straight to what do the models mean. In particular, I'm, again, comparing California's results to all of the other states and sort of giving you a general sense of, across everybody, what's important. And across all the states and the regions, respondents' contexts, certain measures of their existing context, that is, things that measure that measures their residence, things they already have, the cars they already have, the travel they already undertake, the context into which they're asking themselves, can I fit a plug-in or fuel cell electric vehicle? Can they charge a plug-in vehicle at home? Do they commute to work in a private vehicle, that is in a vehicle that they own? Turns out how many vehicles they own and how many new vehicles they've bought since 2008, purchased or leased since 2008, don't appear in the models. Measures of the variability of their travel, measures of the flexibility to swap vehicles within households don't show up. Their attitudes toward the policy goals and tools that are part of that context we talked about at the very beginning. Across most states, it's air quality, not energy supply and security, and not global warming and climate change that is most strongly associated with which drivetrains people design. In particular, the more you perceive that air pollution is a risk in your region and you perceive it as a personal threat, the more likely you are to design a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. Incentives. I limited the variable here to the federal incentive because it's the only one that's available to everyone regardless of state or region. If you are aware already that the federal government offers incentives to consumers, you're more likely to design a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. Alternatively, if you support the idea of incentives being offered for hydrogen and or electricity, you're more likely to design a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. Specific assessments of plug-ins and fuel cell vehicles also enter the models, as you might imagine. If you already believe that electricity or gasoline is a likely replacement for gasoline or diesel, you're more likely to design a vehicle that will run on electricity or gasoline. The extent to which respondents have already considered such vehicles, and when I say already considered, I mean before we get to the design games. Before we've taken the measure of the valuation, have they already considered a vehicle for their household? Whether they've seen PEV charging at the parking lots and facilities that they use? Do they have a personal interest in these technologies? Familiarity with all drivetrain types, including conventional vehicles. The more interested people are in vehicles, the more likely they are to design plug-ins and fuel cells. Prior assessments of these vehicles on 6 dimensions related to charging and fueling, purchase price, safety and reliability. The more favorable your evaluations, the more likely you are to design one. And any experience you have driving these vehicles tends to increase the probability that you design one in the games. So I'm going to go back over a few of these things and show you some of the distributions from the states, some of these variables that are correlated to drivetrain designs and drivetrain types. This is, are you familiar enough with these types of vehicles to make a decision about whether one will be right for your household? In the questions, we don't use the acronyms, we spell out the names of things. The scale is -3 is the most negative, no, I'm not familiar with these vehicles, and +3 is the strongest yes. As you might hope for vehicles we as a society have been driving for 100 years, the average score for conventional vehicles is pretty high. It's about 2.5 across all the states. It drops about a full point for hybrids. and about another third of a point for battery electric vehicles, and again for plug-in hybrids before actually going negative for fuel cell vehicles. California is the dark blue column on the right of each color block. The thing that strikes me about this graph, though, really is the drop between conventional vehicles and hybrids. We're coming up on 20 years those things have been for sale in this country. And there's a bigger difference between people's self-rated familiarity of conventional vehicles and hybrids than there is between hybrids and battery electric vehicles. It's also the case, and this is, as I start to look at this data, this is also where I start to form the impression of it's not so much the differences between states, but it's really the similarities. It's like, yes, we can rank order these things, and yes, some of these things are even statistically significantly different, but it really is the idea that we have these high levels for vehicles we're already driving, descending levels for new types of vehicles, down to these actual negative scores for fuel cell vehicles, which really we might imagine these data look exactly as we would expect them to. And I'll come back to that idea of these data sort of seem obvious. Why am I taking your time with them today? When I show you something even more obvious on the next slide. How much driving experience do you have with these types of vehicles? -3 is I have no driving experience at all. 3 is I have extensive driving experience. Note that the scale starts at 0 and goes down from there. The average scores for self-rated driving experience are strongly negative for basically everything. And again, though there are some differences from state to state, those really are almost exactly square blocks. And what matters is the difference between drivetrain types and not the differences between states and regions. I think the overall point of this slide, and as we might expect, of course, average scores for driving experience of fuel cell vehicles, why it's not actually -3. We can talk about the accuracy of the device we use to measure people's driving experience. But this slide, where we expect people might have low driving experience, and the previous slide on familiarity reinforces the point that when we ask people about these vehicles, they are not judging them from the same basis. They simply don't have the same level of knowledge and experience when trying to decide whether or not these new things are of interest or of use to them, or of value to them. A couple things on charging. So the red column is their self-described access to charging at their home parking location. And across the states, 81 to about 74% of respondents say they have access to some level of electric power at the place they charge at least one of their vehicles at home, which seems pretty good. The blue columns have to do with whether or not they've seen an EVSE in the parking facilities that they use. And you see again that in the western states, this tends to be much higher than in the eastern states. Maryland's a bit closer to Washington than certainly the balance of the NESCOM states and Delaware. Now we're starting to get into some of the state comparisons about opportunity, so that in understanding whether or not, or what to make of some of the state data, we have to understand that not everyone uniformly has the same opportunity to, for example, see public charging. Been far more aggressive efforts in places like California, Oregon, and Washington to roll out lots of public EVSEs than someplace like Delaware, where such efforts have been smaller and much more recent. So it's not just that the people in Delaware aren't seeing these things, it's that they couldn't. But going back to this same idea of opportunity, if we look at something like federal incentives, it's a much more even distribution across the states as to whether or not people believe they've heard the federal government is offering incentives, because the incentives are and have been offered everywhere. When we get down to whether they believe their state is offering incentives, again, we have to look at someplace like Delaware and understand, well, there aren't incentives for people to have heard of. So the differences now do start to strongly correlate. If you remember what the shape of the distribution looked like for the valuation, who designed plug-in vehicles, who designed fuel cell vehicles. You're starting to see clearly now that states where people couldn't have seen chargers, where there aren't state incentives, are designing fewer of these vehicles, which I think goes back to the previous two slides of they're starting from an even further removed point of familiarity and experience than people in California, Oregon, and Washington, these other higher awareness states. So this is the prior consideration question that I talked about earlier. At the top in what looks like sort of a goldy orange on my screen are people who say they already own a vehicle powered by electricity. We have a separate question for hydrogen. I'm just going to cover the electricity data today. And that sort of lighter blue are people who have shopped for an electric vehicle, and we threw out this idea because we're trying to figure out who really has seriously engaged with the idea of shopping for these vehicles. Have you visited a dealership to test drive one? And then the purple is, well, we started to gather some information, we haven't really gotten serious about it. And green is, well, the idea's occurred to me, but I haven't done anything about it. And red is, well, it hasn't occurred to me, but maybe someday I will. And the blue at the bottom is, I haven't and I won't. Again, they're ordered from left to right by the sum of the highest levels of consideration, the gold, the darker blue, and the purple. Again, Oregon wins by a hair. California, come on. I'm going to come back to these data, and I'll use them in getting to my conclusions and getting to what I think are the overall effects of the answers that we're hearing today on the prospects for meeting ZEV vehicle sales targets. Okay, so now moving on to the post-game motivations. This is more of a straightforward, we're not statistically analyzing the game results, we're just asking them, why did you design a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle, or why didn't you? So this is the results of a cluster analysis of those people who did design a plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or fuel cell electric vehicle. You'll notice that that axis starts at 1.38, not at 0. I'm doing that, I'm trying to gain clarity by sacrificing completeness. A version of this graphic with all the data plotted is available in the report that is available on the website, which you can access from the website that got you to this seminar. 1.38 represents the average number of points that everybody assigned to all the motivations. So what I'm saying is, if the average score for a cluster, a subset of the people who design a vehicle, is higher than that global average, that's high. And that's what you're seeing, is what are the high motivations? And then what are the clusters that is clustered on which people share which motivations? So at the top you see 4 blue bars. Those are the pro-social motivations. I'm interested in these vehicles because they reduce the effect of my driving on air quality. They reduce what I pay to oil producers. They reduce U.S. oil imports. They reduce the effect of my driving on climate change. This is a group of people who score all of the pro-social motivations highly. Why did I call them pro-social technologists? Well, all the way down at the bottom, they also highly scored, I'm interested in ZEV technology, and 2 things that flow from ZEV technology, which is the convenience of home charging, and the other motivation shared by virtually everyone, which is to save on fuel costs. The other cluster below them, who I've called thrifty environmentalists, you'll notice a cluster of, or a group of red bars in the middle of the graphic. Those are all of the cost motivations. This group scores every single one of them highly. I'm going to save on the purchase price, I'm going to save on fuel costs, I'm going to save on the maintenance costs, and it's the only cluster of people who overtly say the incentives really matter to me, which makes sense because that's how they're going to save money that's how they're going to come close to saving money on purchase costs. And they score 3 out of the 4 pro-social motivations highly, and they score, like almost everyone, I'm interested in ZEV technology highly. The purple cluster I've called ZEV tech hedonists because they don't care about any of the pro-social motivations. This is just going to be the greatest car they've ever owned. They're interested in ZEV technology. This car is going to fit their lifestyle. It makes the right impression on family and friends. They like the looks of the car. They're going to save on fuel costs. They're safer. They're more comfortable. They'll be fun to drive. Where's my Tesla? So there are 2 motivations shared by all 3 of these clusters, saving money on fuel costs and we are really interested in ZEV technology. Keeping in mind, this is 38% of the sample. This is the 38% of people who in California who designed a plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or fuel cell electric vehicle. There's a fourth group there. You can't see them because none of their scores actually rise above the global mean. Turns out it's because they spend so few points in the exercise. The respondents are given up to 30 points to spend in this exercise. They can spend as many as 5 points on any one motivation. The three clusters I've described on average spend 27 of their 30 points. This group spent only 9 of their points. So never mind clustering, let's go back and look at what they scored highly. The biggest group of them score highly save fuel costs or ZEV technology. Those two are clearly the most broadly shared motivations of everyone who designs a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. Why don't people design these vehicles? Again, for California, the group in red, I had a hard time coming up with pithy names for these groups. I don't know what this is. I'm worried about a lot, charging mostly. So if you look at the very bottom, unfamiliar technology, that red bar, very high average score within this cluster of, I am simply unfamiliar with this technology, and therefore I'm willing to design a vehicle that runs on it. At the same time, though, these people I think are also telling us, I can't charge at home. That's what the high score on no home charging or fueling is. This is a group that's saying, I can't charge or fuel one of these vehicles at home. They're very concerned about a limited fuel network. And they're also concerned about the effect of these vehicles on the reliability of electricity supply. So lots of concerns. I don't know what it is. I have a lot of concerns about charging, both how would I charge and what's the effect on electricity supply. The blue cluster, well, they're worried about a lot also. They score 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 motivations highly. They're worried about range. They have the highest score for limited range. They're worried about the purchase costs of the vehicle. They're worried about a limited fuel network. To me, this sounds like the classic arguments for why consumers are going to be concerned about these vehicles. High purchase price, no place to charge, driving range. In that sense, a little different than the first group. The last group is also one of those groups where the clusters that only has a couple things that sort of creep above our threshold of the average score. But it turns out it creates the same or the analogous counter motivations to the people who did design vehicles. People who did design these vehicles were going to save money on fuel costs, and they like ZEV technology. The shared motivation in the people who didn't design these vehicles is high purchase cost, and I don't know what this technology is. So to try to put all of this to the purpose of understanding progress towards ZEV goals, and now I'm going to attempt a population level estimate of what some of these results mean. So starting with the number of occupied housing units from the US Census and taking data from the American Community Survey on how many households own vehicles, multiplying that by an estimate of how many households who own vehicles meet our definition of new vehicle buyer. They bought or leased at least one new vehicle within the previous 7 years. I actually have that estimate only for California, that 33%. I've applied it everywhere else until I get better data. And then taking the percentages for each state and region of those people who designed a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. You multiply across the rows, and in the last column on the right is our population level estimate of the number of households that our respondents represent who ought to have a positive valuation for plug-in or fuel cell vehicles. It turns out to be just under 1.5 million households in California and about 3 1/3 million households summed across all of the study states and regions. So what does that mean? So this enigmatic little diagram. The largest circle on the right is the almost 12 million households in California who own cars. Smaller circle in the middle, solid circle in the middle, is the 1/3 of those people who meet our new car buyer definition. That orange and blue smudge at the bottom of them, if you look at the middle circle of new car buyers, that's the 8% or so of people, if you go back to our consideration data, have you already considered one before you play our games? That's the 8% of California new car buyers who either own one or seriously shopped for one. And it turns out to be like 2 or 3% if we put it into the population of all car-owning households, which is the little smudge at the bottom of the big circle. Now, switching what we're counting from households to vehicles, the red circle is the about 200,000 plug-in vehicles sold in California cumulatively from January 2011 through March of 2016, 3 weeks ago. The dotted circle around it is 1.5 million ZEVs on road by 2025. And we'll ignore the tiny blue dot for the moment. It's not a bad pixel, it's really there. The question is, what do we do to fill in the space between the red circle representing cumulative sales and the dotted circle representing on-road, 1.5 million ZEVs on-road by 2025? One of the things that our research suggests is, well, how about we ask people? Now that orange and blue smudge at the bottom of the circle is the 38% of people who, when we ask them, when we put them into a design space and say, what would you like your next new car to be? That's the 38% of people that now start to fill up that middle circle. And as I just calculated in the previous table, that's about 1.5 million households. So we've pretty much gone a long way to filling in the dotted circle. We don't have to fill in the dotted circle with just sales to households. Some of those vehicles will be sold to governments, NGOs, and businesses. We also know from other work being done that households who do buy plug-in vehicles often buy more than one. So it takes far fewer than 1.5 million households to have 1.5 million vehicles. Now, it would be unfair to say that I can sell 1.5 million vehicles in California tomorrow. These people have positive valuations. They're interested. They'd like their next new car to be one of these things. There are lots of things that they're going to need to move them from that point to a purchase. But I also want to point out the 62% of people who didn't design a plug-in vehicle, and back up again to the data on familiarity and experience, and to the statistical modeling results that say if you do have experience, and if you do give more positive scores to your evaluations of the specific performance attributes of plug-in and fuel cell vehicles, you are more likely to design one. That is, we have two ways, I think, to build market here. One is to engage the people who have positive ZEV evaluations, and the other is to start to engage the people who have negative valuations, to overcome their unfamiliarity, to overcome their lack of experience. We give them familiarity and experience. Not all of them are going to decide this is the right vehicle for them. Some of them are still going to say no. But they can't say yes if we don't ask. So, to conclude, despite low awareness, knowledge, experience, and prior consideration across the states and regions in this study, 24% to 39% of respondents designed a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle as their next new vehicle, and in California that number is 38%. You might recall from the graphic I showed you that the NESCOM figure was 27%. There's a state, New Jersey, in NESCOM, that's the 24%. The population level estimate that I've produced indicates that that's 3 1/3 million households across all the study states and regions that have a positive ZEV evaluation, and it's almost 1.5 million households in California. The effect of incentives as offered in the games was to increase the number of people who design their next new vehicle to be a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle by 20%. This despite the fact that the other thing that happens between going from the first game to the last game is I take away the possibility of designing full-size vehicles with battery-powered, all-electric capabilities. I do this because we're trying to position households within the near to mid-term, and over that time period, the mass, size, and cost penalties providing battery-powered operation in full-size vehicles is, I think, simply too large to present it as a realistic possibility to people. So if they do design such a vehicle in the first game where I allow it, they then go through a series of games in which they have to decide which do they want more, full-size, or battery-powered all-electric drive. Among those who do not design a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle, offering them increased incentives appears to have had little effect. Across the states and regions, only 2.5% to 5% of the people who don't design one say, if the incentives had been higher, I might have been tempted to do so. Most households with negative ZEV valuations have yet to ask themselves, is a PEV or fuel cell vehicle the right one for my household? They're not saying, except for that 10 to 20% that I showed you in the prior consideration data of people who say, I haven't and I won't. By and large, people aren't saying they don't want these vehicles. They're just not asking themselves the question. The litany of motivations against designing a PEV, we have one cluster who has 10 highly scored motivations, another cluster with 11 highly scored motivations to not design plug-ins or fuel cell vehicles. The very length of that list may be as important as anything on the list. Ironically, signaled perhaps by the fact that one of the things on the list is, I'm simply unfamiliar with this technology. It's one of the two dismotivations shared by everyone who doesn't design a plug-in or fuel cell vehicle. The importance of awareness, knowledge, experience, and prior consideration. 38% of people have a positive ZEV valuation, at least in part because they are interested in ZEV technology. 62% have a negative valuation because they're not interested in new technology. They're not interested in being, as our interview respondents say, not interested in being a guinea pig. I'm not interested in being the person who has to test this thing out. The problem with chronically low levels of familiarity is if we don't do anything to approach that 62% who don't already have a positive valuation, to improve their familiarity knowledge is, if they are unaware of passing generations of improving ZEVs, they always think they're being asked to be the risk taker. We're already into next generation Nissan Leafs and Chevy Volts, at least, if not some of the other vehicles too. They're not aware the vehicles are available. If it's just going by unnoticed, when they find out about it, it's new to them and they still think they're a risk taker. Thus, promotional policies that mitigate the upfront costs, which have been shown to be important in the real world and in our survey, still leave those people who are averse to new technology with an expensive unknown. Promotional policies that prompt awareness and provide knowledge and experience address that unknown. Those with positive ZEV valuations have multiple motivations, suggesting multiple media messages to reach them. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion about the erosion of the saving on fuel costs motivation because of reduced gasoline prices. But as we saw, everyone who's motivated by saving on fuel costs is strongly motivated by something else. We still have messages of new, exciting ZEV technology. We still have pro-social messages. We still have lots of ways and messages and therefore media to reach those people who do have positive ZEV valuations. So I will close there, offering only my thanks to all of the funding states and agencies, and I believe I owe it to them to actually take a moment to read it off to you, so please, the California Air Resources Board, the Delaware Department of Natural Resource and Environmental Control, the Maryland Air and Radiation Management Administration, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and the Washington State Department of Ecology. I thank them, and I thank you all for your attention today, and I believe now we have time for questions.
Is this thing on? First question we'll take off the web. It's a simple one. Simple to ask anyway. How do you know people who didn't elect to design an electric vehicle just didn't want to take the time to do so?
How do I know the people who didn't
elect to design an electric vehicle just didn't want to take the time I guess, during the survey to do so.
Okay, so I suggest my hesitation would mean I don't have a ready answer for that. Okay, I can't answer it.
Was
but
it any more time consuming to choose a conventional vehicle than a electric
sure. If you stipulate that your starting vehicle is whatever it is, and you just want to move down to the bottom of the design game and check it off and move on, that can happen. So, the short answer is, I don't know. I can find out by going back and looking at how long it took people to complete the questionnaire, knowing that people who just checked off a conventional vehicle would have spent less time anyway. I guess the question becomes, do they spend so much less time that we think that all they did was check a box at the top, check a box at the bottom, and move on? And did they ever bother to play with any of the other options? Now, this is going to be an arcane answer, the way the data fields populate is anytime you play in the space, you start to populate data in the database. I can also go back and see if people who selected a conventional vehicle populated any of the data. If they did, then they took the time. They were playing the game and at the end said, no, these things are too expensive or whatever, and I'm going to go back to my starting vehicle. So I don't know, I can check.
Thank you very much, Ken. My name is Tom Beloga from Audi. Two questions. Could you elaborate a little bit on the question regarding the ZEV tech? What were they responding to? Why was that a reason for them to buy? I didn't get the detail of what was being asked of that. And then the why don't they buy, you mentioned in your survey safety. Could you elaborate on either of those two, ZEV tech and safety?
So ZEV technology in the survey is asked in a very straightforward way as to whether or not you are interested in this zero-emission vehicle technology, whatever they think that is. In the follow-up interviews, we get a good deal more of that, which is why we do the interviews, as to what is ZEV technology to them. And it comes wrapped up in experience. Those people who have some experience of electric drivetrains will speak about the driving characteristics, the driving feel of cars with electric motors. Part of this is clearly attached to the Tesla brand and the image of Tesla as a high-tech company, as much as it's perceived by our respondents to be an automotive company. So there are a couple things going on there. Probably, if our interview subjects are to be the standard by which we really answer your question, it probably has to do more with the perception of the Tesla brand than with direct experience of electric drivetrains. People who, whether or not, and then backing up to even other research we've done where we've interviewed PEV drivers themselves, and even Tesla drivers themselves will refer to the vehicle in language that's more descriptive of computers and high technology than vehicles. We'll talk about coming out in the morning and find out that the car software's been updated and liken that to it's like getting a new car. So relating aspects of owning and using computers to owning and driving their motor vehicle. In that sense, I think it's a blending of automotive technology and now moving into information technology. So there's the drivetrain aspect of it, through Tesla, the information technology aspect of it, starting to broaden people's ideas about what they think automotive technology is. On the safety side, we asked, for the people who don't design plug-in vehicles, there's a question both about vehicle safety and fuel safety. Electricity as a fuel safety issue did not come up in the interviews so much. Vehicle safety, I think, still has to do largely with crash safety. And it's part of, I think, just the unfamiliarity of what is this vehicle. In the same way that concerns about batteries are, what is this thing? I don't know what it is. When we hear people talk about their concerns about batteries, part of that is battery disposal. No one bothered to talk about how hard it is to dispose of a car. But for electric vehicles, where's that battery going? Where's my F-150 going? I don't know, but where's that EV battery going? So there's a certain disconnect brought up, I think, by the fact that the electric vehicle is new, and so it tends to prompt questions of what about this, what about that?
Question from the web. Ken mentioned that he would explain why the fuel cell vehicle law with the gain.
So the
Slide 14.
the driving experience, okay, we'll go back to slide 14. The driving experience question is not part of the game. The driving experience question comes before the game. We used why isn't it -3? It probably actually really is a mechanical issue of how people respond to the survey. We used a slider, and you slide across the scale from -3 to 3. You slide it towards one end and drop it. Maybe you just leave it short of -3. You don't take the time. It's like you got it out there to the left. Alternatively, I wouldn't think it would be the case for fuel cell vehicles so much as hybrids and plug-in hybrids. There's a good deal of confusion between those two types of vehicles, which again, we go to the interviews to really hear that. But the vocabulary people use to talk about these different vehicle types doesn't match the vocabulary that so-called subject matter experts would use. The names aren't the same. They don't understand the names the same way that we do. Fuel cell electric vehicles might have some of that too, despite the fact we spell out the words, despite the fact we talk about vehicles that run on hydrogen. It may simply be that we also have a measure of simply not understanding here. So there's probably two things: vocabulary and literally how do you respond in our survey by moving a slider back and forth across the scale.
I'm Chris Jenks from California Energy Commission, and I had a question about the respondents who were not interested in designing electric vehicles due to their unfamiliarity with the technology. I was wondering, among those respondents, was there a difference in their age compared to the other respondents?
In general, age, like a lot of, well, actually age, like all of the socioeconomic and demographic measures, falls out of the statistical models when we have more specific measures of opinion and attitude towards ZEVs and ZEV policies. So in the model building, knowing that there is a certain socioeconomic and demographic profile amongst the earliest PEV buyers and lessees, higher income, higher education, homeowners, male. The model building actually starts with those variables in the model. And then we start to bring in variables about, so when we bring in the variables that are specific to can you charge at home, that's when the home ownership variable, do you own or rent, that's when that drops out. When we bring in the question specifically about how interested are you in ZEV technology, that's about the time gender drops out. So the model says, in the abstract world of the statistical model, gender doesn't matter. If we'd already, because we know interest in ZEV technology, for example. We know interest in ZEV safety, for example. Age is one of those things that drops out of the models when we have the other measures in it. I actually don't remember now when age drops out. But again, in the abstraction of the statistical model, there isn't a socioeconomic within the statistical model, which is estimated on people who buy new cars, there isn't a socioeconomic demographic profile of ZEV valuation.
I was also wondering if your slides will be available online or if they can be sent. Thank you.
They're online and accessible from the same page that announces the webinar, as I understand.
I'm hoping that despite I can hear the question, please explain why survey respondents were not allowed to select full-size battery electric vehicles final phase of the design. What types of battery electric vehicles could be chosen?
Because we're trying to locate people's answers to the questions in the present and in the near future, that is within the time frame of when they might actually buy their next new car. And because I wanted to know if people don't want plug-in or fuel cell vehicles, is it because they're not presently being offered as full-size vehicles or not? And because in the near to midterm, the mass, size, and cost penalties to provide battery-powered all-electric drive for full-size vehicles are going to be high. I chose to design the games in that way. You can start off in the first game, you can design anything you want to have any kind of drivetrain. And then I take away that trade-off, or I make people who design full-size vehicles play a game that forces them to trade off, do you want electric drive or full-size? Because that's the thing I wanted to know. And it turns out most people stick with a full-size vehicle for their next new vehicle. I think that's the answer to the question. One, they're inordinately expensive in the near to midterm and nobody's offering them. And two, I'm trying to figure out of the people who want full-size vehicles, of the people who initially want full-size battery electric vehicles, do they want battery badly enough to give up full size? And the answer is generally no.
All right, we have more questions from the web. I wanted to ask, what was the biggest difference between consumers in the Northeast versus California in terms of ZEV technology acceptance? That could be New England, actually, which amounts to the same thing.
The biggest differences, well, let's go to here and just the familiarity scores. There is sort of a clear step from, as you look at BEVs, and within each color block, I used BEVs to establish the order. So that's why BEV exactly declines from California to Delaware. But even across the hybrid electric vehicle block and the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle block, it's generally the case that people in the West are more familiar than people in the East. Why? Because we had plug-in vehicles in greater number and greater variety than they did back east. Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, San Diego were four of the Nissan Leaf early launch cities. Bolt was launched about the same time. We simply had for all practical purposes, the Honda Fit and the Honda Fit EV and the Toyota RAV4 EV were mostly a West Coast, if not California, phenomenon. We've simply had more plug-in vehicles and more kinds of plug-in vehicles for longer. So that's why we see differences that's why I think we see differences in familiarity. That's probably, and I alluded to it when I looked for the data on have you seen EVSEs? There's another difference in opportunity. If people in Delaware, as I said before, if fewer people in Delaware say they've seen public EVSEs, they've had less opportunity to do so than have people in Oregon, Washington, California. One of the interesting things to come out of the Oregon interviews was the extent to which predictability of EVSE locations might actually substitute for the actual visibility. There's a big box chain of stores up there, and if people in the Oregon interviews know anything about electric vehicles, and if they've seen chargers, they all say, just go to the Kroger's. Whether it's true that this store has a corporate policy to have chargers at all their stores, the people we talk to in Oregon all think that if you want to find a charger, just go to one of those stores. They have chargers. So in that sense, whether it's real predictability or imagined predictability, even imagining that you know where they are is better than having them not be there at all to be seen in the first place.
Ken, in your conclusions, you mentioned about everyone is highly motivated by fuel cost. And one of the massive challenges, of course, to companies trying to sell this technology to consumers is that the 62% you mentioned feel they are risk takers. They are taking a chance on technology that isn't necessarily proven, or it might have some safety issues, reliability and so forth. From your study, do you have any recommendations for ideas that people have mentioned that you could turn around into motivators to remove these risk-taking aversions, these concerns that people have, the negative feelings? Is there something you can recommend from the study that could be focused on by auto industry to promote the sale of these vehicles based on your assessment of the negative and turn it around into a positive or something that would remove the negative?
So two things. Okay, so let's start with the people who did design these vehicles and the interest in fuel cost savings, which is going to be harder and harder to realize in a world with low gas prices. We still have a large set of these people with strong pro-social motivations, so emphasize those aspects of the vehicles to those people and do so through their media, so that there are specific ways to reach people who have pro-social motivations. Every church, temple, synagogue, ashram with an environmental group has a group of people who discusses environmental issues week to week. We heard this when we did research on hybrid vehicles, that one person in that group buys one, and that group then becomes a focal point for additional sales of those vehicles. So it becomes a matter of targeting people with certain beliefs and motivations, but using the appropriate media to do it. So I think it's much less broadcast, and we have much greater ability these days to target groups of people based on the messages and motivations that they have or that they ascribe to. To your second point, you actually reminded me, I forgot to come back to the tiny blue dot. So here we go, to answer your question about what to do about both the people who have pro-ZEV valuations, how do we get them actually into a car, but also how do we address the awareness and the concerns of the 62% who don't have positive ZEV valuations at this point. So the tiny blue dot off there to the left is the 1,850 people that the PEV Collaborative says participated in a ride and drive event of theirs in 2015. I don't put this up here to demean or denigrate that effort in any way, shape, or form, but to point out how many more tiny blue dots like that we need to get from little brown and orange smudges at the bottom of those circles is actually starting to fill up, to actually get to the point where we have people asking themselves, is this a car for my household? Have I shopped for one? Do I have experience of driving them? It's also unfair to have just one of those little blue dots up there. There are other groups who are holding ride and drive clinics. Charge Across Town is another one, but their goal was 1,000 unique ride and drive participants in a year. So that's another little dot, but it's half as big as that one. We need a lot of little dots like that. And it would be nice to have a catalog of all those little dots so we know what they are, we know where they're occurring. They can talk to each other and develop best practices for how to run ride and drives. So I think that as a next step, targeted messages through appropriate media and the vast amplification of efforts like the PEV Collaborative and Charge Across Town. And anybody out there who's putting on ride and drive events or educational events, the air quality and climate motivations. Every REI store in the country holds classes every month on something for their members. There are 3 REI stores in Sacramento. Month after month, 3 months in a row, there could be an REI store in Sacramento holding a ride and drive event for REI members. And anybody in the general public, I suppose, who wanted to show up. Going after the groups people already belong to and marketing to social groups much more than to individuals at this point, I think is one of the bigger levers we can use to try to get to this point where we have a lot of people asking themselves, we have everybody asking themselves the question, is this the right kind of vehicle for me?
Okay, one last question from the web. Your study sample included both homeowners and those who were not, renters. Can you speak in more detail about the valuation differences between homeowners and renters?
So home ownership versus renting is one of those context and socioeconomic demographic variables that I start with because there is a profile now. More homeowners are buying or leasing plug-in vehicles than renters. That variable drops out when I have direct measures of can you charge a vehicle at home. So to address the question specifically, I would have to go back to intermediate modeling results and review those. Like the very first question we asked, I don't have an immediate answer now. I can review the analysis and comment on that in whatever form is available to me to follow up with those answers.
Any more questions from the audience?
This is a deal with the California Energy Commission. I was just wondering during the interview process, were people aware of like time of use rates if they charge at home or in any other places like that?
In this survey, we leave matters like time of use rates completely out. We already have enough complex ideas that people really don't understand that we're throwing at them. We have done other work where we look more directly at differences in electricity pricing and also in the sources of electricity as to whether it's renewable or not. But within this study, no, there's no data on time of use charging prices. Okay.
If we have time, there are a few more questions that are arriving. Let's see. Do range anxiety concerns go away as expected if the data are cut to just focus on PHEVs, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles? Or you could opine on whether they would go away if you did cut the data on them.
So within the analysis and the variables that we have, the question comes down to if I compare people who design PHEVs to people who design BEVs, no. The dismotivation start over. The motivation to not design a plug-in hybrid, battery electric or fuel cell electric vehicle is asked only of people who don't design those vehicles. So I only know that those people who don't design a plug-in vehicle may or may not have stuck with a conventional or hybrid vehicle because of concerns about driving range. Within the group of people who do design a plug-in vehicle, they designed one. Whatever, and range is one of the things they get to pick. Whatever imagination they have about what that driving range does for them in terms of their ability to use the car on a day-to-day basis, I have to assume they've chosen a range that allows them to travel and use the vehicle as they wish, and therefore I have no idea whether they feel the least bit of anxiety as they anticipate this new plug-in vehicle in their life. So no, I can't. Based on the way the data is structured, I have no way of knowing between the people who did design a battery electric vehicle and did design a plug-in hybrid, whether the people who chose a plug-in hybrid did so because that was a solution to range anxiety.
We have a couple of questions here about the ZEV goal of 1.5 million vehicles in 2025. One asks, states that the California ZEV sales growth averaged about 194% a year between 2011 and 2016, and I don't stand by the math. Given the motivations, counter-motivations of your research studies, do you think that realizing the 1.5 million deployment by 2025 is realistic, and would it be possible to achieve 20% annual growth between now and 2025? Average 20%.
I'll answer the first question as to what the annual growth rate has to average to be to get us there. I can't do the math in my head. I think what I've tried to show today is that yes, we can. We can get to 1,000 or 1.5 million ZEVs on road by 2025. I think what we have is a potential reservoir of many, many households who, if we put the question to them, are actually interested in these types of vehicles. As I think I've tried to work throughout all my comments, I think that this first problem is we're not yet engaging everyone in this question. Now, 2025 isn't that far off, and it would be helpful, I think, to get as many people asking this question sooner rather than later to give us time to do things like get more makes and models into the marketplace, to get more generations of makes and models of plug-in vehicles and fuel cell vehicles into the marketplace, to get the continued build-out of charging and fueling infrastructure, and for people to be aware all along that this is happening. So what we're doing is we're easing the way for those people who already have a positive ZEV valuation, and what this little chart is supposed to show is that it seems like there are enough people who already have that positive valuation. Our problem isn't there aren't people who don't want these cars. Our problem is helping them get into one. And by the way, there's another almost 2/3 of the population, many of whom we can almost certainly, between now and 2025, again, with more makes and models, more generations of vehicles, also get them to change their minds about what they think of plug-in and fuel cell vehicles. I think there's in some sense, I think there's a certain urgency to move now, but I'm not at all yet worried that we're not going to make it.
All right, well, we have too many questions from the web to take all of them now, but I'll finish with this one. What would you recommend California cities include in their climate action plans regarding ZEV technology?
Regarding ZEV technology, let me translate that question into into things that I think that I study more, that ZEV technology is proceeding as automakers, as battery manufacturers, as fuel cell manufacturers continue to develop new generations of the technology and new makes and models of the vehicles. In some sense, the additional role cities can play is to continue to apply pressure to those manufacturers to continue that process of improvement and expansion of the possibilities of electric and fuel cell vehicles. I think the car companies and the other manufacturers will act to the extent that they feel motivated to do so, and it's everybody else's job to motivate them. What that means from the side of everybody else is give them signs of increasing demand. And the more they perceive, the more the manufacturers perceive increasing demand, the more committed they'll remain to the development and improvement of the technology. So cities, whatever it is specifically that cities do, they too can act to help to increase the apparent demand, the real and apparent demand for these vehicles.
Yeah, this is Mark Soroki with ARB. I'm a little confused about the methods you used here, but did the survey respondents or the game players actually design specific vehicle types? I mean, do you have the number of people who design BEVs versus PHEVs versus fuel cell vehicles?
Yes, and also by the ranges that they incorporated into those designs, by whether or not they included quick charging in those designs.
Do you have the percentage of which vehicle types people designed?
Within the PHEV, BEV fuel cell vehicle category, I do not remember the specific numbers. The order of precedence is more PHEVs than BEVs than fuel cell vehicles. Most PHEVs, BEVs in the middle, fuel cell vehicles at least.
Are the specific breakdowns somewhere we can look up?
They're all in the report that's available on the website.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Ken for
Thank you all for your attention.
presenting his findings here today, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.